Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. There are gods who rule from shining heights, gods who cross the sea, gods who govern harvest, flame, desire, war, and storm. And then there is the God whose kingdom receives every king, every beggar, every singer, every warrior, and every forgotten name, yet who rarely leaves his throne to ask for worship. If you enjoy these long, calm histories, a like helps this work find the people who need it. Subscribe as well if you would like a new sleep story each week, told with patience, care, and a little reverence for the old worlds that still linger behind our own. This is the story of the god who ruled beneath the world, not as a devil, not as a monster, and not merely as death itself, but as the keeper of a realm older, stranger, and more orderly than later imaginations often allowed. His story begins before he had a throne, before the rivers of the dead had their ferrymen, before the queen of the underworld had eaten the seeds that bound the seasons. It begins inside the first fearful house of the gods, with Cronus, Rhea, and the children who vanished before they could inherit anything at all. Chapter 1. The Child of Cronus. Hades entered the old story before he had a kingdom, before any poet could call him Lord of the Dead, and before the Greeks had given the lower world its rivers, judges, gates, and ferrymen. He belonged first to a family already troubled by inheritance. The earliest divine order in Greek myth did not begin with calm rule from Olympus, but with earth and sky, with Gaia and Uranus, and with the fear that power, once held, could be taken by the children who came after. In that fear lay the first pattern of the gods. Gaia, the broad earth, bore Uranus, the starry sky, and from their union came a generation of enormous children, strange even among divine beings. The Titans belonged to that first age, and among them Cronus would become the most important for the story of Hades. Uranus, fearing or despising some of his offspring, kept them hidden away in the depth of Gaia, and the earth herself suffered beneath the weight of children who were born but denied their place. Greek myth often begins this way, not with a moral lesson, but with a pressure inside the family of the world. Cronus answered that pressure with the sickle Gaia placed in his hands. He overthrew Uranus and took the power that had belonged to the sky. But the victory did not free him from fear. It gave fear a new owner. The son who had raised his hand against the father now understood, more clearly than anyone else could have understood, what a son might do when the time came. Divine kingship, in this oldest layer of the story, was not secure because it was ancient. It was ancient because it kept being contested. Rhea became the wife of Cronus, and their children were the generation who would later fill Olympus and the world around it with familiar names. Hestia came first in many accounts, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus, though ancient traditions did not always arrange divine births with the neatness later readers expect. Each birth should have enlarged the house of Cronus. Each child should have given the ruling Titan a future. Instead, the prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him made every newborn seem like the beginning of his own ending. Cronus swallowed them. The act is told with the blunt strangeness that belongs to archaic myth. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon disappeared into their father's body, not dead in the ordinary mortal sense, but removed from the world, held in a living prison where no kingdom, marriage, office, or future could yet reach them. Hades, who would later rule the place where mortals went after life, first existed as one of the hidden children himself. There is a quiet irony in that beginning. The god later associated with the unseen was, at the start, unseen because another power refused to let him appear. Rhea endured the loss of child after child until the birth of Zeus brought her to a different resolve. She went to Gaia and Uranus for counsel, and the older powers, who had known the violence of Cronus's rise, helped shape the reversal of his rule. In traditions tied especially to Crete, the infant Zeus was hidden away in a cave, guarded and nourished beyond his father's reach. The myth gathers around that concealment with the texture of old local worship, a child kept from a devouring father, a mountain cave, attendants whose noise protected the secret of a divine infancy. For Cronus, Rhea prepared a stone wrapped in swaddling cloth. The detail is small, but it carries the whole turn of the story. The ruler who had swallowed his children because he feared being deceived by the future was deceived by something that only looked like a child. He took the wrapped stone and consumed it, believing he had preserved his rule once more. Rhea's act did not defeat Cronus in battle. It opened a space in time, and inside that space, Zeus could grow. Zeus's return belongs to the larger movement that would eventually bring Hades into the open. With the help of Metis in some traditions, Cronus was made to release what he had swallowed, and the children came forth again. The stone came out as well, later shown in some Greek traditions as an object with its own sacred memory. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon emerged not as infants beginning their lives, but as gods whose first story had already been one of confinement. Their childhood, if divine beings can be said to have such a thing, had been replaced by waiting. Hades' place among them is easy to overlook because Zeus immediately begins to dominate the story. Zeus is the rescued child, the returning son, the one around whom the challenge to Cronus gathers. Poseidon will later receive the sea and become a god of horses, storms, and earthquakes. Hera will become queen, Demeter the giver and withholder of grain, Hestia the sacred stillness of the hearth. Hades, at this stage, has no visible realm at all. He is a brother restored to the world before the world has made room for him. That absence matters. Greek myth does not introduce Hades as a tempter of souls or an enemy of the gods. He is not outside the divine family, and he is not opposed to its order. He is inside it from the beginning, one of the children whose release makes the Olympian age possible. Later fear of his name, and later discomfort with the realm he governs, can make him seem separate from the bright society of the gods. But the older story remembers him as a son of Cronus and Rhea before it remembers him as king below. Once the swallowed children had returned, the struggle against Cronus could no longer remain a private wound inside one divine household. It widened into a conflict between generations. The Titans belonged to the older settlement of power, and Zeus with his siblings belonged to the order that would replace them. Hades therefore came into his future not through solitary ambition, but through a family war in which the question was larger than any one god. The world itself had to decide which generation would rule it. The restored children did not all receive equal attention in surviving poetry, yet their presence changes the scale of the conflict. Hades stood with Zeus and Poseidon as one of the three brothers whose later division would structure the cosmos. Before sky, sea, and underworld became separate kingdoms, the brothers were joined by a common origin, swallowed by the same father, released by the same reversal, and drawn into the same war against the age that had tried to prevent them from existing as powers in their own right. Around them gathered other divine forces. The Cyclopes, once confined, would become crucial to the new order, and the Hundred-Handers, vast children of the older world, would eventually be brought into the conflict as allies. The story was no longer only about Cronus fearing his children. It had become a rearrangement of divine strength, with old prisoners released and old grievances brought into the open. In mythic memory, the making of a kingdom often begins before anyone names the kingdom itself. Hades had not yet received the dead. He had not yet taken his place beside Persephone. No shade had crossed to him by Charon's boat, no judge had spoken beneath his authority, and no hero had stood before his throne asking to return with what the lower world had claimed. For now, he belonged to the generation that had survived Cronus's fear, and survival itself was enough to place him inside the next great movement of the tale. The children who had vanished were present again, and the father who had swallowed them still held power. The war that followed would give the three brothers their weapons, their standing, and eventually their divided realms. Zeus would not win the future alone, whatever later stories made of his kingship. Poseidon and Hades would stand beside him before either sea or underworld had been formally placed in their hands, and the powers hidden in the earth would begin to rise into the struggle. From the swallowed house of Cronus, the story moves toward the long war before the kingdoms, where Hades receives the first sign of the kind of ruler he will become. Chapter 2: The War Before the Kingdoms. The first order Hades helped to shape was not his own kingdom, but the breaking of another. Cronus still stood at the center of the older divine world, surrounded by the Titans, whose names belonged to the generation before Olympus. Zeus had been hidden, raised, and returned. His swallowed siblings had been brought back into the light of myth, yet release was not the same as rule. The children of Cronus had escaped their father's body, but they had not yet escaped his age. Against Cronus gathered those who had reason to remember the old confinements. The Cyclopes, children of Uranus and Gaia, had been shut away in some versions of the story, and their release joined the new divine cause to a much older grievance. The 100-handers, Cottus, Briareus and Gyges, belonged to that same vast family of beings, too immense and unsettling for ordinary rule to tolerate. Greek myth gives them bodies that are almost architectural in scale, with 50 heads and 100 hands, as if the first world had produced forms too large for the tidy offices of the later gods. The Cyclopes gave the three brothers their signs of power. Zeus received the thunderbolt, the weapon that would make his authority visible across heaven. Poseidon received the trident, the three-pronged emblem that suited the unstable sea and the shaking earth. Hades received the helmet that made its wearer unseen. Among the three gifts, his was the least outwardly magnificent and the most revealing, because it did not command by display. It belonged to concealment, approach, withdrawal, and hidden mastery. That gift is one of the earliest hints of the ruler Hades would become. The helmet did not make him weak because it made him invisible. It gave him a form of power that did not need to announce itself, and Greek imagination would keep returning to that quality whenever it placed Hades apart from the banquets and quarrels of Olympus. Zeus's sign flashed above the world, and Poseidon's could be imagined in the sea's disturbed surface. Hades' sign left no surface at all. The war that followed was the Titanomachy, the struggle between the Titans and the younger gods. Ancient poetry placed it on a scale almost too large for narrative detail, with divine generations set against one another and the order of the cosmos still unsettled. The conflict is sometimes imagined as lasting 10 years, a number that gives the war the breadth of an age rather than the quickness of a single contest. What matters most for Hades' story is not the noise of the fighting, but the settlement that the fighting made possible. Zeus did not win because he was merely stronger than Cronus. He won because he gathered the imprisoned, rewarded the neglected, and made the younger divine generation into a coalition. This is one of the quiet political truths inside the myth. The Olympian order begins not only in victory over an older father, but in the release of powers the older regime had buried, feared, or refused to accommodate. Hades, who would later rule the buried realm, first stands among those who benefit from an earlier release. Tartarus already waits in the story before Hades rules the dead. It is not yet simply his kingdom, and in many Greek accounts it remains distinct from the general place of departed souls. Tartarus is the deep prison of defeated powers, set far below the earth, as distant beneath the ground as the sky is above it. The image gives Greek myth a vertical architecture, heaven above, earth between, and a depth so remote that even gods could be confined there when their age had ended. When the 100-handers joined Zeus, the balance moved toward the younger gods. Their many hands made them figures of overwhelming force, but the myth does not need to dwell on the blow-by-blow movement of divine war. The old order weakened because forces once excluded from it were now working against it. Cronus had swallowed his own children to prevent succession, while Uranus had hidden his troubling offspring away. Both acts returned as causes of ruin. In Greek myth, buried things rarely remain harmless forever. Hades' part in the Titanomachy is less elaborated than Zeus's, and that very spareness suits his later place. Some traditions remember the helmet's invisibility as useful in the war, allowing unseen movement where open force might fail. The detail matters because it grants Hades an active role without turning him into the central hero of the conflict. He is one of the brothers whose future authority is being earned, but the story still holds him partly aside, already shaped by the quality of not being fully seen. The defeat of Cronus did not erase the Titans from mythic memory. Some were punished, some were bound, and some remained connected to the later order through kinship, cult, or story. Atlas, in later traditions, would bear the sky. Prometheus, a Titan by descent, would become entangled with the fate of mortals. Oceanus, in some accounts, stood apart from the direct rebellion. Greek myth rarely clears the stage completely. It lets older powers remain as pressure, memory, and boundary around the newer gods. For Cronus, the end of the war meant the failure of the very fear that had governed his rule. He had tried to stop the future by consuming it, and the future had returned with allies. Hades, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, and Zeus were no longer hidden children inside a father's body. They were powers within a victorious generation, ready to receive offices that would define them more clearly than birth alone had done. The family story had become a cosmic settlement. The Cyclops' gifts carried that settlement forward. Zeus's thunderbolt did not merely help him defeat Cronus, it announced the kind of kingship he would hold. Poseidon's trident did not merely arm him, it linked him to a realm that moves, floods, surrounds, and unsettles. Hades' helmet did not merely conceal him, it matched a dominion that would be present everywhere in mortal destiny and yet remain out of sight until the last passage. The gifts were weapons, but they were also prophecies of office. The imprisoned Titans were placed in Tartarus, and the 100-handers were often imagined as their guards. That arrangement gave the new world a foundation of containment. It did not kill the older powers, nor did it pretend they had never existed. It placed them where they could no longer rule. Hades' later kingdom would also hold what could not remain among the living, though the dead were not rebels in the same sense as the Titans. Containment, in Greek sacred geography, could be punishment, order, or necessity depending on what had crossed the boundary. The victory of the younger gods therefore produced a question rather than an ending. Power had passed from Cronus, but it had not yet been divided. Zeus's leadership in war did not by itself explain why the sea should belong to Poseidon, why the dead should belong to Hades, or why the sky should become Zeus's own portion. The universe after the Titanomachy stood like land after a flood, cleared of one danger and waiting for its borders to be marked. For Hades, this waiting moment is important because he is still not the god later generations fear to name. He is a brother among brothers, a son of Cronus restored, a divine ally in the war that ended the Titan age. Nothing in this stage makes him evil. Nothing places him outside the sacred family. His future realm will be grave and remote, but it will arise from the same victorious order that gives Zeus the sky and Poseidon the sea. The old war, then, prepares the lower kingdom without yet entering it. Tartarus has received the defeated Titans. The helmet has marked Hades with the power of invisibility. The brothers have stood together long enough to overcome the father whose fear had once hidden them away. What remains is the act that turns victory into geography and kinship into dominion. After the war before the kingdoms, the sons of Cronus must divide the world they have inherited. Chapter 3. The lot that gave him the dead. Victory left the sons of Cronus with a world that still needed shape. The Titans had been confined, the older fear had lost its throne, and the younger gods stood with a power that had to become more than triumph. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were brothers before they were rulers, joined by birth, by concealment, by release, and by the war that had brought Cronus down. Yet brotherhood alone could not govern heaven, sea, earth, and the hidden region where mortal life would finally pass. The Greeks remembered the settlement through the casting of lots. It was a simple action for so large a consequence, and that plainness gives the story much of its force. The brothers did not divide the cosmos by sentiment, nor by seniority alone, nor by choosing the realm that seemed most pleasing to each of them. They let chance, or something wearing the face of chance, assign the great dominions that would define their divine lives. Hades received the underworld. That result has often been misunderstood by later imagination. It can seem, at first glance, like exile, as if Hades were pushed away from brightness because he was darker than his brothers. The myth itself is more measured. Zeus received the sky, Poseidon received the sea, and Hades received the realm beneath the living world, while the earth and Olympus remained common to them in important ways. The lot did not cast him out of the divine order. It gave him one of that order's necessary provinces. The settlement also made Zeus king among the gods without making every other god merely his servant. Zeus's sky gave him height, weather, thunder, and the public authority of Olympus. Poseidon's sea gave him breadth, movement, horses, earthquakes, and the temper of waters that could carry ships or deny them passage. Hades' portion gave him what no living creature could finally avoid. His realm was not visited casually, not celebrated in the open air with the same ease as fields or harbors, but its claim reached every palace, hut, battlefield, and bed. This is one of the remarkable balances inside the Greek divine world. The most visible god is not the only necessary one. Zeus may preside, Poseidon may disturb the coasts and crossings, but Hades holds the place that completes the mortal story. To speak of him only as grim is to miss the administrative seriousness of his role. He is frightening because his realm is final for ordinary mortals, yet he is also stable, lawful, and less given to restless interference than many gods whose names sounded easier on the tongue. The lot therefore gave Hades a kingship that was both immense and removed. He did not become a wandering god of sudden death. That office belonged more properly to Thanatos and to the many causes by which mortals came to their end. Hades ruled what followed. His power began after the last breath, after the pyre, after burial, after the living had done or failed to do what custom required. In that distinction, the Greeks preserved a careful separation between the moment of dying and the realm of the dead. Poseidon's kingdom could be heard in waves and storms. Zeus's could be seen whenever clouds gathered above the mountains or lightning marked the sky. Hades' kingdom had no such daily spectacle. It was known through absence, through ritual, through names spoken carefully, through the stories of heroes who crossed its boundary and returned changed. Even his famous helmet from the Cyclopes suited this settlement, because the god and his portion shared the same quality of hidden presence. The earth itself remained shared, and that detail matters. Hades did not own the soil in the ordinary sense, even though his realm lay beneath it, and Zeus did not lose concern for mortals because the sky had become his portion. Olympus, too, remained a common divine gathering place, though Hades appears there far less often in surviving myth than his brothers. His distance is not the distance of rebellion. It is the distance of office. A ruler whose subjects are the dead does not move through the stories of the living in the same way as a god of marriage, war, wine, or the sea. Ancient worship remembered this distance with caution. Hades was not ignored, but he was approached differently, often under softened names, and often with gestures that acknowledged the unease of calling too directly upon the Lord below. Later Greeks might call him Pluton, the wealthy one, because the ground beneath mortal feet held not only the dead, but also grain, roots, metals, and hidden richness. Already, in the allotment, the seeds of that double meaning are present. What lies below is feared, but it is also the source of things the living cannot do without. For Zeus, the lot confirmed a public kingship. For Poseidon, it confirmed a restless and forceful domain. For Hades, it confirmed a realm that would make him less visible in myth precisely because his authority was so complete where it applied. The dead did not vote among gods, flee to rival shrines, or negotiate their way back into ordinary life. Once they passed into his keeping, the stories that mattered were not stories of escape, except for the rare heroes and musicians whose exceptions proved how firm the boundary usually remained. The underworld was not yet fully furnished in this chapter of the mythic order. Charon had not yet appeared in the story as the ferryman of the dead. The rivers had not yet been traced in all their later names and meanings. The judges had not yet taken their seats, and Persephone had not yet become queen beside Hades. Still, the essential act had occurred. The lower realm had a ruler, and the ruler had a place within the family settlement of the cosmos. Hades' kingship also changed the meaning of his earlier concealment. The child swallowed by Cronus had been hidden helplessly, held inside another's fear. The god who received the underworld was hidden by office, not by captivity. His invisibility had become authority. This is a quiet transformation, but an important one. Greek myth often allows an early wound or condition to return later as a sign of power, reshaped by the order that follows. From this point onward, Hades belongs to two worlds at once in the imagination. He is a brother of Zeus and Poseidon, part of the same victorious generation, and he is also the god whose own kingdom separates him from the usual life of Olympus. He can be invoked among the Olympian family, yet his house is elsewhere. He is divine kin, but not easy company. He is present in the order of the world, but not in the brightness where the other gods so often quarrel, feast, desire, and interfere. That separation helped later storytellers give him a solemnity unusual among Greek gods. Zeus is magnificent, but he is restless. Poseidon is powerful, but he is quick to anger. Apollo shines with order and danger together. Athena reasons and fights. Aphrodite unsettles households and cities through desire. Hades, by contrast, is rarely shown pursuing novelty. The dead come to him in unending number, and his task is not to seek them, but to receive them. Such a god does not need many adventures. The casting of lots, then, is less a punishment than a definition. It explains why Hades is feared, why he is remote, why he is wealthy in later names, why he is not the same as death itself, and why his kingdom can be imagined as both dreadful and orderly. The Greeks did not need him to be beloved. They needed him to be there. A cosmos with sky and sea, but no place for the dead, would be unfinished, and the sons of Cronus had just inherited a world that required completion. So Hades passed from rescued brother to appointed ruler. The war had given him standing, the Cyclopes had given him the helmet, and the lot had given him the realm that would carry his name. Beneath the shared earth, beneath the fields of Demeter and the cities of mortal kings, a kingdom now belonged to him. Its borders still had to be described, its paths named, its guards placed, and its crossings imagined. After the lot that gave him the dead, the story turns toward the rivers beneath the living world. Chapter 4. The Rivers Beneath the Living World. Once Hades had received his portion, the underworld began to take shape as more than a depth beneath the feet of the living. A kingdom, even in myth, requires passage, boundary, custom, and office. The dead did not merely vanish into a dark remainder of the world. They crossed, were guided, were received, and in later traditions were judged, remembered, or forgotten according to laws older than any one city. Hades' rule therefore became visible through the beings and places that served him, because the god himself rarely needed to appear. Hermes was one of the first figures who made that passage intelligible. Among his many offices, he became Hermes Psychopompos, the guide of souls, moving between worlds with an ease that most gods did not possess. He belonged to roads, thresholds, messages, trade, luck, trickery, and crossings, so it was fitting that he could lead the newly dead away from the living without being trapped among them. In this role, Hermes did not rule the underworld. He delivered souls toward the order that waited there. The dead, in Greek imagination, were not always described with a single geography. Older poetry, local cult, later philosophical teaching, and mystery religion all shaped the lower world differently. Yet certain names gathered strength until they became almost inseparable from the thought of Hades' realm. Rivers with their own characters, a ferryman who required payment, a hound who guarded return, and waters that could divide memory from release. The underworld grew through such details, not as a map in the modern sense, but as a sacred arrangement of thresholds. Burial mattered because passage mattered. A body left without proper rites did not belong easily to either world, and Greek stories return often to the unease of the unburied dead. Patroclus appears to Achilles in the Iliad and asks for funeral rites before he can pass fully into the house of Hades. Elpenor, in the Odyssey, will later ask Odysseus for burial after his unnoticed death at Circe's island. These scenes carry a social duty as well as a religious one. The living owed the dead the forms that allowed separation to become complete. Charon entered this imagined order as the ferryman. He is not prominent in the earliest Homeric picture in the way later art and literature would make him, but over time he became one of the most recognizable servants of the underworld. The dead came to the water and Charon carried them across for a fare. Later Greek burial practice often placed a coin with the dead, commonly understood as payment for the crossing, and even where customs varied by place and period, the idea was clear enough. The journey beyond life had its own small economy. There is something quietly exact about that fare. Death, which strips away houses, titles, and possessions, still receives in myth the image of a final payment. The coin is not wealth in any grand sense. It is a token that the living have performed their part, a small metal sign that the dead are not being sent away unattended. Hades' kingdom, in this detail, is not disorderly. It has a crossing, a ferryman, and a rule. The river most solemnly associated with divine boundary was the Styx. Gods swore by it, and an oath sworn upon the Styx carried dreadful force in Greek myth. Hesiod describes the river as connected to the deep order of the cosmos, and the gods who broke such oaths suffered a long exclusion from nectar, ambrosia, and divine assembly. The Styx therefore belonged not only to the dead, but to truth among immortals. It marked a place where even gods encountered consequence. Acheron, often imagined as a river of sorrow or woe, became another crossing of the dead. Cocytus carried the sound of lamentation in its very name. Phlegethon burned in later underworld geographies with fire, while Lethe offered forgetfulness, the loss or softening of memory that allowed souls in some traditions to move toward another state. These rivers were not simply decorative. They gave qualities to the passage: grief, oath, burning, forgetting, and the irreversible movement away from ordinary life. The underworld's geography varied because Greek myth was not one book written by one hand. Homer's shadowy house of Hades, Hesiod's deep Tartarus, later Orphic and philosophical teachings, tragic poetry, vase painting, and local cult all contributed to the realm's changing form. A tired modern reader may want a single plan of the place, with fixed gates and measured distances, but the Greeks preserved something more fluid. Hades' realm was stable in meaning even when its details shifted. Cerberus guarded that stability. The hound of Hades appears in different traditions with different numbers of heads, though the later image of 3 became the most familiar. Hesiod gives him 50 heads, an older and more monstrous abundance, while later poets and artists shaped him into the 3-headed guardian known across the ancient and modern imagination. His office matters more than the count. Cerberus allowed the dead to enter and prevented them from leaving. A gate needs a guardian because a boundary is only meaningful if it holds. Cerberus was not merely a monster placed for fear. He was the living sign that Hades' realm was not a road to be traveled casually in both directions. Heroes might pass by rare permission or extraordinary power, and a few myths would turn precisely on that exception. But ordinary souls did not wander back among the living because they missed the sun. The hound made return into a divine problem, not a matter of desire. Hades ruled over this whole system with a distance that suited his office. He did not need to ferry souls himself, or guide them from their homes, or stand at the gate as guard. Kingship in myth often appears through delegation: messengers, judges, guards, servants, sacred objects, and established paths. Zeus has Iris and Hermes. Poseidon has sea creatures and suns. Apollo has priests and oracles. Hades has Hermes at the threshold, Charon at the water, Cerberus at the gate, and later judges in the realm beyond. The newly dead, once carried over, were often imagined as shades. In Homer, they possess memory and voice, yet their existence is thin compared with life. Achilles, among the dead, will later tell Odysseus that he would rather serve a poor man on earth than rule among all the departed. That statement does not make Hades unjust. It shows the older Greek sense that death, even when ordered, is a lessened condition. The underworld is necessary, but necessity does not make it beloved. Other traditions softened or complicated that bleakness. Elysium and the Isles of the Blessed offered different destinies for favored souls, heroes, or those specially loved by the gods. Mystery religions promised forms of hope that ordinary public myth did not always provide. Philosophers would later speak of the soul with their own arguments, reshaping the underworld into moral and metaphysical territory. Still, the older kingdom remained beneath those developments, Hades as receiver, keeper, and ruler of the dead. The rivers also made the underworld feel older than the Olympian quarrels above it. Water in Greek myth often marks separation, purification, danger, and oath. To cross water is to enter another condition. Mortal life itself depended on rivers, springs, rain, and sea routes, yet the rivers below were not for drinking, farming, or sailing toward trade. They carried souls away from the familiar uses of water into a region where movement meant departure rather than commerce. This is why the underworld's details are more than atmosphere. Charon's boat, Hermes' guidance, Cerberus' watch, and the river's names all turn death into a governed transition. Hades' power becomes understandable through them. He is not imagined as rushing through the world to gather the dying. He waits at the end of a system that already knows how to bring them to him. The living may fear his name, but the myths rarely present his realm as chaos. Persephone had not yet entered that realm in the story being followed here, and without her the underworld's kingship remained severe and solitary. Hades had his portion, his crossings, his servants, his waters, and his guardian, but not yet the queen whose presence would bind the world below to the flowering and failing of the earth above. The dead could now be imagined passing into an ordered kingdom. What the kingdom did not yet possess was the sacred tension of return, the seasonal grief of Demeter, and the maiden whose arrival would change the meaning of Hades' throne. Chapter 5. Persephone taken, Demeter wandering. Persephone enters the story of Hades as the figure who changes his kingdom without first belonging to it. Before she becomes queen beneath the earth, She is Kore, the maiden, daughter of Demeter, moving in the circle of flowers, fields, and young divine life. Her name later carries the weight of the underworld, but the older feeling of the myth depends on this contrast. The one who will sit beside Hades begins as the child of the goddess who makes grain rise from the soil. Demeter's power belonged to the earth in its nourishing form. She was not the earth itself as Gaia was, but the divine force of cultivated fertility, grain, harvest, and the human labor that turned wild ground into bread. The Greeks understood very well that life depended not only on sunshine and rain, but on the fragile agreement between seed, season, soil, and work. Demeter stood close to that agreement. Where she withdrew, the world did not merely become sad, it ceased to feed its people. The story of Persephone's taking is told in several ancient forms, but the Homeric hymn to Demeter gives it one of its fullest and most enduring shapes. Persephone is gathering flowers with the daughters of Oceanus when the earth opens, and Hades rises to carry her away with the consent of Zeus. The flower that draws her hand is often named as the Narcissus, a strange and beautiful bloom placed there as a snare. The detail is important because the abduction begins not with open battle, but with a moment of attraction made dangerous by divine arrangement. Hades, in this tradition, does not act as an outlaw outside Olympus. That is part of what makes the myth so unsettling. Zeus has permitted the marriage, and Hades, as brother of Zeus and ruler of a necessary realm, claims Persephone according to a divine logic that does not ask Demeter's heart for consent. The violence is therefore not the violence of chaos against order. It is the violence that can exist inside order itself, when kings, fathers, and husbands decide the fate of a daughter whose own voice is scarcely allowed to shape the settlement. Persephone cries out, and the cry is heard by Hecate in her cave, and by Helios from his path above the world. Demeter hears the sound as well, but she does not know where her daughter has gone. In the hymn, the mother begins to wander with torches in her hands, refusing nectar and ambrosia, searching through the world for the child who has vanished. The image of the goddess carrying torches is not merely decorative, it became part of the sacred memory of Demeter's search, especially in rites connected with Eleusis. For 9 days, Demeter wanders. The number gives her grief a ritual shape, a measured duration before knowledge arrives. Hecate comes to her, not with the answer, but with confirmation that a cry was heard. Together they go to Helios, the sun who sees what others cannot, and from him Demeter learns that Hades has taken Persephone with Zeus's permission. In that revelation, her sorrow changes into anger because the loss is no longer mysterious. It has a name, a throne, and a divine accomplice. Demeter withdraws from the company of the gods. She leaves Olympus and moves among mortals in altered form, reaching Eleusis, where she comes to the house of Celeus, the local king, and Metanira, his wife. The hymn gives this part of the story a quieter human scale. A goddess whose grief has interrupted the fertility of the world sits among women by a well, disguised in age and sorrow, and she is brought into a mortal household not as a queen of heaven, but as a nurse for a child. The child is Demophon, son of Celeus and Metanira. Demeter tends him, and in some versions she begins to make him immortal by placing him in the fire at night and anointing him with ambrosia. Metanira sees the act and cries out, terrified by what she does not understand. Demeter's anger then reveals her divinity, and the mortal household learns that it has hosted a goddess in mourning. The miniature is one of the most delicate in Greek myth, because divine blessing and human fear pass very close to each other and fail to meet. At Eleusis, Demeter commands that a temple be built for her. She remains there, apart from the gods, and her refusal becomes larger than private grief. The fields stop bearing. Seeds do not rise as they should. Mortals face hunger, and the gods themselves begin to lose the offerings that sustain their honor among human beings. Demeter's pain therefore becomes a crisis for the entire divine order. A mother's mourning reaches the altars. This is one of the myth's most powerful movements. Persephone's disappearance begins as the loss of a daughter, but it becomes the suspension of agriculture, worship, and the ordinary exchange between mortals and gods. Demeter does not need to overthrow Zeus in order to resist him. She can refuse her own function. By withholding grain, she shows that the king of Olympus cannot rule a living world if the goddess of harvest will not allow that world to live. Hades remains below during much of this wandering, and that distance affects how the story feels. He has taken Persephone into a realm already marked by boundaries, rivers, and returnlessness. From the surface, the underworld is not a place one enters to negotiate easily. Demeter's search is therefore also a search against the structure of Hades's kingdom. The daughter is not hidden in some distant valley or island. She is held where ordinary paths do not go. Yet the myth does not leave Persephone as only a stolen maiden. Even in the grief of her taking, the outline of her future queenship begins to appear. Hades has not brought her into a house of casual desire, but into a throne world, grave and ancient, where she will eventually possess authority of her own. Later stories will show her seated beside Hades, receiving the dead, hearing pleas, and sometimes softening the sternness of the realm. The cost of that enthronement is never erased, but the throne itself becomes real. For Zeus, the famine creates an impossible pressure. If Demeter continues to withhold fertility, mortals will perish, sacrifices will cease, and the honor of the gods will diminish. The divine settlement that gave Hades his portion has now collided with the living earth above it. Hades' right, Zeus's authority, Demeter's motherhood, and Persephone's absence cannot all remain as they are. The cosmos requires compromise, because no single divine claim is enough to sustain the whole. Messages begin to pass among the gods. Zeus sends Iris and other gods to persuade Demeter, offering gifts and honors, but she refuses to restore the fields until she sees her daughter again. Her demand is not abstract justice, nor a broad reform of divine marriage. It is the return of Persephone. The simplicity of that demand gives the story its emotional force, because all the divine politics, cosmic offices, and sacred arrangements have narrowed to the presence of one missing child. Hermes is finally sent to Hades. The messenger who guides souls across thresholds must now cross downward for a different purpose, not to bring another shade into the kingdom, but to ask the Lord below to release the queen he has taken. Hades receives the command of Zeus, and in the hymn he agrees to let Persephone return, though not before the act that will bind her partly to his realm. The underworld is willing to open, but not to surrender its claim completely. Persephone's return therefore approaches with a condition already forming beneath it. Demeter's grief has drawn the gods into negotiation, and the famine has shown that the surface world cannot live forever under the shadow of the loss. Still, Hades is not a powerless figure whose marriage can simply be undone. He rules a realm where crossing changes the one who crosses. Before mother and daughter can be restored to one another, a small red fruit will carry the weight of the bargain. The story that began in a field of flowers now turns toward the pomegranate seeds. They will decide how much of Persephone belongs to the upper world, how much belongs to the lower, and how the grief of Demeter will be folded into the rhythm of the year. Hades has gained a queen, Demeter has forced Olympus to listen, and Persephone stands between two worlds that can no longer be separated as cleanly as before. Chapter 6. The Queen and the Seeds. Eleusis stood between loss and return, a small place in the story where the grief of Demeter had become powerful enough to trouble Olympus. The fields had failed because the goddess of grain would not let them bear, and the hunger of mortals had begun to threaten the honors of the gods themselves. Zeus could command many things from the height of his rule, But he could not make barley rise from unwilling earth, while Demeter withheld her gift. The disappearance of Persephone had become a crisis larger than one household of gods. Hermes descended to the realm of Hades as messenger, crossing the boundary that he knew better than almost any other Olympian. In his usual office, he guided souls away from the living, but this journey carried a different purpose. He came not with a newly dead mortal, not with a summons to judgment, and not with one more shade for the halls below. He came with Zeus's command that Persephone be returned to her mother, so that the earth might breathe again through seed, stalk, and harvest. Hades received the message without open rebellion. The hymn does not make him a god who storms against Zeus or refuses the order of Olympus. He speaks to Persephone as one who knows both his own authority and the settlement now required among the gods. She is to return, yet she is also promised honor below, a share in his kingdom, and reverence among those who come to the house of Hades. The words matter because the myth is not only about rescue, it is also about the making of a queen. Before Persephone leaves, Hades gives her pomegranate seeds to eat. The fruit is small beside the scale of the story, smaller than the famine, smaller than Zeus's command, smaller than Demeter's rage, yet it becomes the object on which the whole compromise turns. In Greek sacred imagination, to eat in a place could bind one to it. Persephone has not merely visited the underworld, she has taken something of it into herself, and that act gives Hades's realm a claim that return cannot completely undo. The pomegranate carries its own quiet fitness. It is a fruit of many seeds hidden inside a hard red rind, and later readers have often noticed how naturally it belongs to a story about fertility, secrecy, bloodless binding, and return. The myth does not need to explain the symbol too heavily. It lets the fruit do its work. Persephone eats, and the world above will not receive her in the same condition in which it lost her. Hermes leads her upward, and Demeter sees her daughter again. The reunion restores what the famine had made unbearable, but the restoration is not simple enough to erase the underworld. Demeter asks whether Persephone has eaten anything below, and when the seeds are revealed, the terms of the new order become unavoidable. Persephone may return to her mother, but she cannot remain forever above. A portion of the year will belong to Hades, and a portion will belong to Demeter. Ancient versions differ on the number of seeds and the division of time. Some traditions speak of a third of the year below and 2/3 above. Later tellings often imagine 6 months with Hades and 6 months with Demeter. The exact arithmetic matters less than the sacred pattern. Persephone's life is divided, and the earth's fertility follows that division. When she is restored to Demeter, growth returns. When she goes below, the living world feels the withdrawal. This compromise is one of the great Greek ways of joining divine story to ordinary season. It gives grief a calendar. It lets the visible changes of the year carry the memory of a mythic separation, not as a scientific explanation in the modern sense, but as a sacred correspondence between family, kingdom, and field. The seed buried in soil and the daughter below the earth do not become the same thing, but they speak near one another in the imagination. Persephone's new place is not only seasonal, she becomes queen of the underworld, and that title changes the realm she entered by force. Hades remains the ruler, grave and unyielding, but he is no longer the solitary lord of a kingdom without a goddess beside him. Persephone's double life gives her a range that no other Olympian possesses in quite the same way. She knows the flowers of the upper world and the throne of the dead. She belongs to mourning and return, to maidenhood and majesty, to the mother's embrace and the husband's house. The Greeks could call her Kyrie, the maiden, when they remembered her as Demeter's daughter. They could call her Persephone when they remembered the queen below. In some contexts, especially where sacred caution shaped religious speech, names themselves carried weight. To name powers of the underworld directly was not always comfortable, and reverent indirection could soften fear without denying authority. Hades would later be Pluton, the wealthy one. Persephone too could be approached through titles that respected the mystery of her divided power. Demeter, once reunited with her daughter, allows the earth to bear again. Grain returns as the sign that the divine household has reached an arrangement mortal life can survive. Fields are not merely background to the myth. They are the place where divine settlement becomes bread, where the decision of gods enters the hands of farmers, millers, bakers, mothers, children, and cities. A story that began with a girl gathering flowers ends by explaining why human beings must wait upon the season and trust the buried seed. Eleusis holds the memory of this settlement with unusual force. There, according to the hymn, Demeter established rites that would become among the most revered mysteries of the Greek world. The details of the Eleusinian mysteries were guarded by secrecy, and that secrecy itself became part of their power. Initiates did not openly describe what they had seen and heard, yet ancient testimony suggests that the rites offered hope, not by denying death, but by placing human life inside a sacred pattern of loss, descent, return, and blessing. Triptolemus belongs to that Eleusinian world as a figure connected with the gift and spread of grain. In later art and tradition, Demeter sends him out to teach agriculture, sometimes in a winged chariot, carrying the knowledge that allows cultivated life to extend across human communities. This detail brings the myth close to civilization itself. Grain is not only food, it is storage, settlement, labor, ritual, taxation, festival, and the long patience by which a city survives from one harvest to the next. The underworld's claim on Persephone therefore does not leave the upper world barren forever. It creates alternation. Greek myth often resolves unbearable conflict not by removing one side, but by arranging a rhythm in which competing divine claims can endure together. Hades keeps his queen for the appointed portion. Demeter receives her daughter back for the appointed portion. Zeus preserves the wider order. Mortals receive the returning grain, while still living under the knowledge that every return has its limit. For Hades, the bargain strengthens rather than weakens his place. He does not merely possess a realm assigned by lot, he now shares it with a queen whose story binds his kingdom to the living year. The dead still come to him. The rivers still mark the crossings. Cerberus still guards the gate, but the throne below has become part of the cycle by which the earth above changes its face. His rule remains hidden, yet it touches every harvest. Persephone's divided presence also changes how the dead may imagine the realm they enter. A kingdom ruled only by Hades could be understood as final reception, stern and still. A kingdom ruled by Hades and Persephone carries another tone, not gentle exactly, and never free from fear, but capable of petition, recognition, and sacred dignity. In later stories, mortals who descend will sometimes appeal to Persephone as much as to Hades, and her presence gives the lower world a second authority, one shaped by both loss and return. Demeter's grief does not disappear. It is given a place in time. That is different from being healed in the ordinary sense, and the myth is wise enough not to pretend otherwise. Each return contains the knowledge of the next departure, and each departure contains the promise of return. The surface world continues because the gods have accepted an arrangement that no one wholly desired, yet all must honor. Such compromises are among the oldest forms of peace in myth. So the story of Hades grows wider through Persephone. The god who once received the underworld by lot now rules a kingdom connected to grain, marriage, mourning, sacred secrecy, and the seasons themselves. Demeter's famine has ended, but the price of ending it has become the rhythm of the year. Beneath the fields that turn green again, the lower realm remains, ordered and watchful, and beside Hades sits the queen whose presence makes the underworld not only a destination, but a court. From this divided reign, Greek imagination could move further into the question of what happens after the dead arrive. If Hades has a kingdom, then that kingdom may have order beyond passage. If Persephone sits beside him, then the dead may stand not only before a place, but before powers. And once the souls have crossed the rivers and passed the guardian, another thought begins to gather beneath the old stories, that lives might be weighed, sorted, and remembered differently in the halls below. Chapter 7. The Judges of the Dead. Judgment entered Hades' realm slowly, as Greek imagination gave the afterlife more shape than the older shadow world had possessed. At first, the dead could seem gathered together in a dim equality, kings and servants alike reduced to shades, still themselves in memory, but thinned of the force that had once made life desirable. Yet stories do not remain still, especially when they are asked to carry the questions that ordinary life cannot settle. If the wicked flourish, if the brave die young, if oath-breakers prosper, and if the pious disappear into the same darkness as everyone else, then the world below begins to receive a burden that the world above has left unresolved. Hades ruled this developing realm as its king, but judgment itself came to be associated with named figures who had once lived as mortal kings. Minos of Crete, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus became the great judges of the dead in later tradition, each carrying into the underworld a reputation formed in life. Their presence matters because the afterlife is no longer imagined only as a destination. It becomes a place where the shape of a life may be recognized, distinguished, and assigned. Minos was remembered as a king of Crete, son of Zeus and Europa, and in many traditions, a ruler whose authority had been unusually close to divine law. He was also a complicated figure, attached to stories of power, desire, punishment, and the labyrinthine house of Knossos. Greek myth rarely gives its judges spotless simplicity. What it gives them instead is weight, figures large enough in memory to sit where ordinary mortals could not sit, hearing the dead after their own lives had passed into legend. Rhadamanthus, often named as Minos' brother, received a reputation for justice so strong that some traditions placed him among the blessed after death. Aeacus, king of Aegina and another son of Zeus, was remembered for piety and fairness, and later stories made him a keeper of keys or an assistant in the ordering of souls below. Together, these three create a strange and solemn court, not because the Greeks imagined the underworld as a tidy legal chamber, but because judgment needed faces, names, and offices. The dead came into a realm where life's distinctions had not wholly vanished. Birth, wealth, beauty, and power had been left behind in the ordinary sense, but memory remained, and so did the stories attached to a person's conduct. Judgment below is therefore one of the ways Greek myth begins to answer an old discomfort. A city can fail to punish wrongdoing. A family can conceal guilt. A tyrant can die in his bed. Hades' realm, once given judges, becomes a place where unfinished moral accounts may be carried farther than the grave. This was not the only Greek view of death. Homer's dead are often sorrowful because they are dead at all, not because they have been assigned to precise rewards and penalties. The shade of Achilles speaks with a plain bleakness that later consolations never fully erase. Still, alongside that older picture, other traditions grew more morally arranged. The underworld widened, and within it certain places became associated with punishment, purification, privilege, or blessedness. Tartarus remained the deepest and most terrible region, older than many of the later moral divisions and already known as the prison of defeated divine powers. The Titans had been confined there after the war, and its distance beneath the earth gave it a scale beyond ordinary burial or ghostly wandering. When later imagination placed great offenders there, Tartarus became not only a prison for cosmic enemies, but a depth reserved for those whose crimes had violated the order of gods and mortals alike. It was not simply the underworld, it was the underworld's farthest severity. Elysium offered another possibility. In some traditions, it was a place for those specially favored by the gods, a region of ease at the edge of the world or within the afterlife's broader geography. The Isles of the Blessed developed as a still more fortunate destiny, sometimes imagined for heroes or for souls who had passed through cycles of life with exceptional purity. These places show that Greek thought about death was not fixed in one dark tone. It could be austere, hopeful, aristocratic, moral, poetic, and local, all at once. The judges made such distinctions intelligible. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus did not need to appear in every account for their presence to matter. Once the underworld could be pictured as a place of sorting, Hades' kingship gained another dimension. He was not only the receiver of the dead or the lord of the locked gate, he presided over a realm where the lives of mortals might arrive with consequences still attached to them. Burial rites remained the first duty of the living, and judgment did not replace that duty. The dead still needed passage. They needed lament, grave, pyre, tomb, or whatever rites belonged to their community and period. Greek families cared for graves with offerings, libations, and remembrance, and the neglected dead could become troubling presences in story and ritual. Before a soul could be judged, it first had to be acknowledged as dead, separated from the living with the honors that made the boundary bearable. There is a human tenderness inside that practice, even when the theology around it is severe. Burial says that the dead have not merely been discarded by life. A name, a marker, a poured offering, a strand of hair, a garment, a coin, or a spoken lament gives form to the passage. The underworld begins at the edge of family duty as much as at the rivers of myth. Hades' kingdom receives what the living have released with whatever care they could manage. The moral geography beneath the earth also helped poets and worshippers think about justice without pretending that justice was always visible above. The Greek world knew war, piracy, slavery, betrayal, plague, and political ruin. It knew that noble birth did not guarantee noble conduct, and that cleverness could be used against guest, host, family, or city. The realm of judges and assigned destinies allowed myth to imagine a longer arc than civic law could always provide. It did not solve suffering, but it gave suffering a place within a wider order. Persephone's presence beside Hades gives this moral order a second tone. As queen of the dead, she is not merely Demeter's daughter retained below for part of the year. She is a power to whom mortals and heroes may appeal, and her name appears in contexts where the lower world is approached with reverence rather than simple dread. Hades holds the authority of kingship. Persephone brings into that authority the memory of return, the knowledge of both realms, and a dignity shaped by having crossed the boundary herself. The judges then do not diminish Hades. They reveal the kind of kingdom he rules. A weak king must do everything with his own hands. A settled king has officers beneath him, names that carry delegated authority, procedures that endure beyond any single arrival. Hermes guides, Charon ferries, Cerberus guards, Minos and his companions judge, and the dead move through a world whose seriousness comes from order rather than spectacle. The lower realm is frightening because it is final, but it is also coherent. Not every soul received the same story after death. Heroes could be honored in cult. The ordinary dead could remain close to the family through grave offerings and memory. The blessed could pass into gentler regions. The great offenders could descend into punishments that made their names permanent warnings. Between these destinies, Greek myth preserved many uncertainties, and those uncertainties are part of its truth. The underworld was not one doctrine. It was a gathering place for fears, hopes, rituals, poems, and local traditions that continued to speak to one another. For Hades, this widening afterlife confirmed the gravity of the lot he had drawn after the Titanomachy. He had not received a lesser share because his kingdom lacked sunlight. He had received the most unavoidable realm, and as stories deepened, that realm became capable of holding moral memory as well as mortal absence. The dead did not come to him as a crowd without distinction only. They came bearing names, deeds, honors, failures, crimes, prayers, and the traces of how the living had sent them away. The next turn in the story follows those whose traces became warnings. some souls in Hades' realm were remembered not because they were blessed, nor because they were ordinary, but because their punishments gave visible form to the violation of sacred boundaries. The judges of the dead suggest that lives may be sorted below. The great offenders show what Greek myth imagined when a life had crossed too far against gods, guests, kinship, or the laws that held the world together. Chapter 8. The Great Offenders Beneath the Earth. Punishment in Hades' realm was remembered most clearly through names. The Greeks did not need long lists of anonymous sinners to make the lower world morally legible. They gave it figures whose stories could be carried in a few words and whose torments repeated the shape of the offense that had brought them there. Sisyphus with his stone, Tantalus with his unreachable water and fruit, Ixion with his wheel, and the Danaids with their leaking vessels became more than inhabitants of punishment. They became arguments in mythic form. These figures did not all belong to one simple category of wrongdoing. Some offended against the gods directly. Some violated kinship, hospitality, oaths, or the sacred limits between mortal cleverness and divine authority. What joins them is the sense that certain acts disturb more than private conscience. They disturb the order by which gods, families, guests, hosts, and the dead remain in their proper relation to one another. Hades' realm preserves these offenders because the world above could not leave their stories unfinished. Sisyphus is the clearest figure of repetition. He was king of Corinth, or Ephyra as it was called in older tradition, and his fame rested on cunning so extreme that it became a danger in itself. Cleverness was not condemned by Greek myth on its own. Odysseus is praised for it, Hermes delights in it, and many heroes survive because they can think in ways stronger men cannot. Sisyphus's cleverness becomes different because it refuses boundary altogether, even the boundary of death. The stories told of him vary, but they share the feeling of a man who treats divine order as something to be negotiated, tricked, and delayed indefinitely. In one tradition, he reveals a secret of Zeus. In another, he deceives Thanatos, the personification of death, binding him so that mortals temporarily cease to die. Such a tale has the strange humor of myth, but beneath it lies a serious disturbance. If death itself can be tied up by a king's trick, then sacrifice, inheritance, battle, old age, mourning, and the whole passage into Hades lose their appointed form. The punishment of Sisyphus answers that offense through endless return. He pushes a stone upward, and before the task can be completed, it rolls back, leaving him to begin again. The force of the image lies in its restraint. There is no need for elaborate cruelty. The stone, the slope, the almost finished labor, and the return to the beginning are enough. A man who tried to escape the finality of divine order is given a task without finality of his own. There is a quiet precision in that punishment. Sisyphus wanted delay, and he receives delay without release. He wanted to outwit the end, and he receives an action that never arrives at an end. The stone does not merely hurt him, it answers him. Hades' realm, in this story, does not punish by confusion. It makes the offender live inside the form of his own defiance. Tantalus belongs to a different violation. He was connected to the gods with unusual intimacy, sometimes described as a son of Zeus, and he was said to have shared in divine company. That nearness should have produced reverence. Instead, the myths remember him as one who abused sacred trust. In some accounts, he steals nectar and ambrosia. In the most dreadful version, he serves his son Pelops as food to the gods, testing whether they will know what has been placed before them. The story is told without needing to linger on the physical horror, because its meaning is already severe. Tantalus violates hospitality, fatherhood, and the sacred difference between mortal cunning and divine knowledge. A table, which should be a place of offering and fellowship, becomes the site of an attempted deception. The gods recognize the offense, and Pelops is restored in later tradition, marked by the missing shoulder that Demeter, distracted by grief in some versions, had consumed before the deception was revealed. Tantalus's punishment gives him desire without satisfaction. He stands in water that withdraws when he bends to drink. Fruit hangs above him and recedes when he reaches upward. Like Sisyphus, he is not placed in a random torment. He is held inside the shape of frustrated appetite. The man who violated the sacred table is surrounded by food and drink that refuse to become his. That refusal has made his name endure. To tantalize is still to hold fulfillment near enough to awaken desire and far enough to deny it. The old punishment passed into language because it understood something durable about wanting. Hades' realm, through Tantalus, becomes the place where appetite without reverence turns into appetite without end. Ixion's offense moves through another sacred boundary. He was a mortal king who committed crimes against kinship and hospitality, and Zeus, in one version, purified him and brought him among the gods. Mercy should have bound Ixion to gratitude. Instead, he desired Hera, the queen of Olympus, and attempted to cross a limit no guest, no dependent, and no mortal should have approached. Zeus shaped a cloud in Hera's likeness, and from Ixion's union with it came the line of the centaurs in some traditions. His punishment is the wheel. Bound to it, he turns without rest, a figure of motion that goes nowhere. The image suits him because his desire had lost the stillness of proper place. Guest turned against host, recipient of mercy turned against benefactor, mortal longing turned toward the wife of Zeus. The wheel answers the disorder with circular permanence. It moves continually, yet grants no journey. The Danaids, daughters of Danas, carry a collective punishment rather than the solitary emblem of one offender. Their story belongs to the tangled mythic history of kinship, marriage, and flight. Danaus and his brother Aegyptus become locked in conflict, and the 50 daughters of Danaus are married to the 50 sons of Aegyptus. On their wedding night, at their father's command, most of the daughters kill their husbands. Hypermnestra alone, in many accounts, spares Lynceus because he honors her wish and does not force her. The punishment of the Danaids is to fill vessels that cannot hold water. They pour and pour, but the containers leak and the labor never gathers into completion. Once again, the underworld gives form to the offense. Marriage, which should have joined houses and continued family lines, becomes broken at the threshold. Their punishment turns domestic labor, water-bearing, and household service into endless futility. The vessel receives, but does not keep. Hypermestra's exception matters because Greek myth is often more intricate than a single moral label. She disobeys her father and spares her husband, and later tradition treats her differently from her sisters. Within the larger story of the Danaids, her choice keeps alive the thought that obedience is not always justice, and that kinship commands can themselves become corrupted. Even in a myth of collective punishment, a single name can carry a counterweight. These punishments belong to Hades' realm, but Hades himself is often less visible than the offenders. That is fitting. A king does not need to appear in every sentence of the law for the law to belong to his kingdom. The stone, the fruit, the water, the wheel, and the leaking vessels operate within the order he rules. His presence is structural. He is the sovereign beneath whom these repeated conditions endure. Persephone, too, stands somewhere within this moral geography, especially in later imagination, where she receives the dead beside Hades and hears the petitions of those who enter. The underworld is not only masculine severity, it is a court with a queen whose own story was shaped by crossing, loss, and return. When mortals descend in later myths, they may appeal to both rulers, and the possibility of appeal makes the punishments feel even more deliberate. Mercy exists, but not as the undoing of order. The great offenders reveal what Greek myth feared in acts that break sacred limits. Sisyphus tries to delay death and bend divine knowledge to his advantage. Tantalus corrupts the table shared with gods. Ixion violates gratitude and guesthood. The Danaids turn marriage into blood debt and household promise into emptiness. Their punishments do not merely hurt, they remember. Each one preserves the offense in a shape that cannot be forgotten. There is no need for Hades' realm to shout over these figures. Their repetition is enough. The stone returns. The water withdraws. The wheel turns. The vessels leak. In a world where mortal life passes quickly and public memory can be unreliable, the underworld gives certain stories a strange permanence. The dead may fade, but some names remain sharp because punishment keeps speaking them. From these offenders, the story of Hades turns toward a different kind of challenge. Sisyphus tried to outwit death through cunning, and the punished figures remain below because their acts disturb divine boundaries. Yet another mortal will come to Hades' realm not with trickery, violence, or appetite, but with music and grief. Orpheus will stand before the throne with a plea that does not deny the law of the dead, but asks for one beloved shade that the law might bend. Chapter 9. Orpheus before the throne. Orpheus came to the realm of Hades with something very different from the weapons of Heracles, the cunning of Sisyphus, or the royal arrogance of those who had been punished below. His power was music, and Greek tradition remembered that music has more than skill. Stones, trees, rivers, animals, and even the hard attention of gods could be moved by the sound of his lyre. Such a gift did not make him immortal, and it did not exempt him from grief, but it gave his sorrow a language that could travel farther than ordinary speech. He was the son of the muse Calliope in many traditions, and sometimes of Apollo, sometimes of the Thracian king Oeagrus, depending on the telling. Thrace itself, to Greek imagination, often carried an old association with song, wild rites and powers near the edge of the familiar world. Orpheus belonged to that borderland of poetry and sacred knowledge. He was not merely a singer who entertained courts. He was the figure through whom music seemed capable of persuading nature, softening violence, and reaching the hidden structures of the world. Eurydice enters his story as the beloved whose death turns that gift toward Hades. Ancient versions differ in detail, but the later and best-known tradition tells that she died after being bitten by a serpent, sometimes while fleeing the unwanted pursuit of Odysseus. Her life ends before marriage can settle into ordinary duration. Orpheus mourns her with a grief so complete that the upper world no longer gives him enough room to carry it. The singer who could charm living things turns toward the one kingdom where his song should have no power. The descent of Orpheus is not the same as a heroic conquest. He does not enter Hades' realm to seize a prize, test his strength, or prove a king wrong. He goes because the dead have taken Eurydice, and because his art cannot accept that loss without asking whether the boundary can be crossed in reverse. This is what makes the myth so tender and so dangerous. Orpheus does not deny Hades' law in words, but his journey asks whether love, carried in music, may receive an exception from it. The path downward brings him past the ordinary terror of the lower world. Later poets imagine the punishments pausing as he sings, the stone of Sisyphus resting for a moment, the wheel of Ixion ceasing its turn, Tantalus forgetting his thirst, and the Danaids leaving their vessels. Such images do not need to be treated as mechanical facts of the underworld. They show what Orpheus represents. His music is not stronger than divine order forever, but it can suspend attention, soften repetition, and create a small interval in which even punishment seems to listen. There is a limit, though, to what beauty can do. That limit is the heart of the myth. Greek stories often honor art without making it omnipotent. A song may move stones, but it does not abolish the ground on which stones rest. A lyre may make the rulers of the dead hear a mortal plea, but it cannot turn the underworld into a place where all losses are simply reversed. Orpheus enters the court of Hades at precisely that point where tenderness meets law. Hades and Persephone receive him as rulers, not as monsters. This matters. The story would be smaller if the underworld were governed only by cruelty, because then Orpheus's music would merely melt a wicked heart. Instead, he stands before powers who have the right to refuse him. Hades is the keeper of a boundary that mortals do not cross backward. Persephone, who herself knows the division between upper world and lower, sits beside him with a different resonance, not opposed to his authority, but deepening the court before which Orpheus pleads. The song itself is rarely quoted in a stable ancient form across all traditions, and that absence is fitting. What matters is not a fixed lyric, but the idea that grief has found its most persuasive shape. Orpheus sings of Eurydice, of love interrupted, of the briefness of mortal life, and of the inevitability that both he and she will one day belong to Hades fully. He does not ask to make her death unreal forever. He asks for time. In a realm where time no longer belongs to the dead in the ordinary way, the request is both modest and enormous. Persephone is often imagined as especially receptive to the plea. Her own story makes that natural, though the myth does not need to turn her into a simple figure of pity. She knows what it means to be carried below and mourned above. She knows the upper air and the lower throne. If Hades' authority gives the underworld its firmness, Persephone's presence gives this judgment its tragic intelligence. The court can hear Orpheus because it is not chaotic. It can answer him because it is ruled. The answer is conditional mercy. Eurydice may follow Orpheus back toward the living world, but he must not look behind him until both have fully reached the upper air. The condition is simple, and that simplicity makes it almost unbearable. No monster must be defeated. No riddle must be solved. No vast labor must be performed. Orpheus must walk, trust, and not turn. The whole return from death is placed inside the discipline of a single withheld glance. Hermes, who knows the roads between worlds, is sometimes present in the wider tradition of such passages, and the logic of his office hovers near the scene even when he is not foregrounded. The journey upward is still a crossing, still a movement through boundaries that no mortal controls. Eurydice follows behind Orpheus as a shade not yet restored fully to the living. She is near enough to be hoped for and too far to be touched. The condition requires Orpheus to believe in a presence he cannot verify. That is the hardest form of trust. It asks him to live, for the length of the ascent, without the confirmation grief most desires. He has sung before Hades and Persephone, gained what no ordinary mourner receives, and begun the return with Eurydice behind him. Yet the silence at his back grows heavier than refusal might have been. The mind can survive a closed door more easily than a door that opens under one condition. Orpheus must keep faith with what he cannot see. Near the threshold, he turns. The ancient storytellers knew the power of placing the failure so close to success. Eurydice has not fully returned. The condition has not been completed. The glance that should have confirmed her presence becomes the act that loses her again. In some tellings, she speaks only a brief farewell or no accusation at all. The gentlest versions do not need reproach. Orpheus's own action has said enough, and the underworld reclaims what it had only conditionally released. Hades does not need to pursue him. The law has done its work. Eurydice falls back, not because the rulers below are newly cruel, but because the bargain has been broken. This is the stern beauty of the myth. Mercy was real, and so was the condition attached to it. Hades had allowed the impossible to approach possibility. Orpheus failed not against malice, but against the difficulty of trusting a gift that could not be checked before it was complete. The loss is therefore different from the first death. At first, Eurydice was taken by accident, fate, or the ordinary danger of mortal life, depending on the version. The second loss comes after appeal, after song, after divine hearing, after a path had opened. It carries the ache of a world in which even the greatest art cannot protect the beloved from the final authority of the dead. Orpheus has not been powerless, but neither has he been powerful enough. Afterward, he returns alone. The myths of his later life vary, and some traditions tell of his refusal of other women. his devotion to the lost Eurydice, and his death among the women of Thrace. Those later stories belong to another movement, but they preserve the same central truth. Orpheus remains marked by the underworld even after leaving it. He is the singer who entered Hades and came back without the one for whom he went down. His music had reached the throne, but not changed the nature of the realm forever. For Hades, the story reveals a kingship more complex than simple refusal. He can hear, he can grant, he can allow an exception shaped by pity, art, and Persephone's presence. Yet he does not dissolve the structure of his kingdom. The dead are not returned because grief is eloquent, or because love is sincere, or because music is beautiful. One shade is permitted to follow under a condition, and when the condition fails, Hades remains what he was, the ruler of a boundary that cannot become a road for ordinary longing. The myth of Orpheus endured because it gives neither easy consolation nor cold dismissal. It honors grief by letting it descend as far as grief can go. It honors art by allowing song to reach the rulers below. It honors love by making the attempt worthy even though it fails. And it honors the underworld by refusing to make it a place that can be permanently undone by any mortal gift, however beautiful. So the court of Hades returns to stillness after Orpheus leaves it. Persephone remains beside the king. Eurydice remains among the dead. The rivers continue to divide the realms, and Cerberus keeps the boundary that even music crossed only for a little while. From this sorrowful exception, the story turns toward another kind of descent, one not made by a singer with a lyre, but by the strongest of heroes, commanded to bring the hound of Hades into the light. Chapter 10. Heracles and the Hound of Hades. Cerberus stood at the edge of Hades' order as the living sign that entrance and return were not the same thing. Souls could pass inward, guided by Hermes, carried by Charon, and received among the dead, but they did not pass outward by longing or argument. The hound's office was therefore more than monstrous guarding. He embodied the firmness of the lower realm, the rule that the dead may enter and the living may fear, but the boundary itself does not loosen because someone wishes it would. Heracles came to that boundary near the end of his labors. The king who commanded him, Eurystheus of Tiryns, had already required tasks that moved beyond ordinary human strength. The Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, the Erymanthian boar, the Cyrenean hind, the Augean stables, the Stymphalian birds, the Cretan bull, the mares of Diomedes, the belt of Hippolyta, the cattle of Geryon, and the apples of the Hesperides in the traditions that arrange the labors in their familiar number. Each labor placed Heracles against a creature, a distance, a king, or a sacred difficulty. The last demand reached beyond the living world itself. Eurystheus ordered him to bring up Cerberus from Hades. The command has the quality of a ruler trying to exhaust a hero by asking for what should not be possible. Cerberus was not a beast wandering in a forest, nor a prize hidden at the edge of the sea. He belonged to Hades' house. To take him meant entering a realm whose very meaning rested on the fact that living men did not go there and return at will. Heracles prepared for the descent not only through strength, but through initiation in some traditions. Ancient sources connect him with the Eleusinian mysteries before his journey below, because entry into sacred knowledge could mark the hero as more than a trespasser. The detail is important, even where versions differ. Heracles does not merely break through the underworld by force. His descent is framed, at least in part, by ritual permission, purification, and the recognition that Hades' realm is not common ground. The hero's path downward brought him into contact with the dead and with figures whose stories already belonged to the lower world. In some accounts, he encountered Meleager, the Caledonian hero, and from that meeting would later be linked to Deianira, Meleager's sister. He also found Theseus and Pirithous, whose presence in Hades' realm carried a very different lesson. Their descent had not been commanded as a labor nor shaped by reverent purpose. It had been an act of overreaching desire. Theseus and Pirithous had made a pact to marry daughters of Zeus. Theseus took Helen in some versions when she was still very young, and Pirithous chose Persephone herself, queen of Hades. That choice turned heroic boldness into sacrilege. The two companions descended to the underworld, intending to seize the wife of its king, and Hades received them with the kind of hospitality that becomes judgment. He offered them seats, and when they sat, they could not rise. The punishment is calm in its shape and severe in its meaning. Theseus and Pirithous are not destroyed in a scene of divine rage. They are fixed. The guests who entered another king's house with a crime in mind become unable to leave that house at all. In many later tellings, Heracles is able to free Theseus, while Pirithous remains below, the deeper offender, because Persephone was his intended prize. The distinction preserves the moral structure of the tale. Dissent alone is dangerous, but dissent for violation is another matter. Heracles' own purpose, though extraordinary, is treated differently. He comes under command, and in many versions he approaches Hades directly. The Lord of the Dead does not vanish from the story here. He must be asked, confronted, or persuaded, depending on the tradition, because Cerberus is not ownerless. Some accounts say Hades allows Heracles to take the hound on the condition that he use no weapons. Others remember a struggle in which Heracles subdues Cerberus by strength alone, holding him until the guardian yields. In either case, the condition matters. The hero may pass only under limits. There is a useful restraint in the version where Hades permits the attempt without weapons. Heracles is not allowed to make the underworld into a battlefield. He must meet the guardian as a test of force, endurance, and divine allowance, not as a conqueror sacking a foreign city. Even the strongest mortal descended hero must accept the rules of the place he has entered. Hades' authority remains intact because the exception is granted from within his order, not torn away from outside it. Cerberus himself gathers many layers of older imagination. Hesiod gives him 50 heads, a monstrous abundance suited to the deep house of Hades. Later art and poetry settle more often on 3, a form easier for the eye to hold and powerful enough to endure. Snakes sometimes coil around him or rise from his body. His tail may be serpentine. His bark belongs not to ordinary alarm, but to the terror of a boundary that recognizes what should not pass. However his body is counted, his office remains constant. Heracles seizes the hound and leads him upward. The image is among the most astonishing in Greek heroic myth, the guardian of no return brought, for a brief interval, into the world of the living. Yet the story does not make this a permanent defeat for Hades. Cerberus is not killed, not tamed into an earthly companion, and not transferred to another master. He is borrowed under the pressure of a labor, displayed and returned. The underworld suffers an exception, not a conquest. When Heracles brings Cerberus before Eurystheus, the king's command turns against him in the form of fear. The ruler who had ordered the impossible now sees the impossible arrive. In comic and vase painting traditions, Eurystheus may hide in a great storage jar, a pithos, as the hero presents the hound. The detail has a homely absurdity that Greek myth often allows around Heracles. After so much cosmic weight, a frightened king in a jar reminds the listener that heroic grandeur and human ridiculousness can occupy the same story. That moment is the miniature center of the labor. Heracles stands with the underworld's guardian under his control, and Eurystheus, who thought command could protect him from danger, shrinks before the result of his own demand. Cerberus has been brought into the light, but the light does not make him less of Hades. He remains the creature of the lower gate. His presence above ground is unsettling precisely because everyone knows where he truly belongs. The labor also clarifies the difference between Heracles and the great offenders. Sisyphus tried to evade death's finality. Tantalus abused intimacy with the gods. Ixion violated the sacred relation of guest and host. The Danaids broke marriage at its threshold. Heracles enters the underworld under burden, not rebellion. His violence across myth is immense, and his life is far from morally simple. But in this labor he does not seek to overturn Hades' kingship. He fulfills an imposed task and leaves the realm's structure standing. Hades, therefore, is not humiliated by the story. A lesser version of the myth might have made the hero's success depend on overpowering the god of the dead. The stronger myth does something subtler. It allows Heracles to achieve the impossible while preserving Hades' authority. The hound returns, the dead remain. The gate continues to mean what it meant before Heracles came. A boundary can admit one exceptional crossing without ceasing to be a boundary. Persephone's presence in these descent stories continues to matter. Theseus and Pirithous descend because of her, and their punishment reveals her status not as captive maiden, but as queen whose violation would be an offense against the whole lower order. Heracles, by contrast, passes through the realm without trying to possess what belongs to Hades. The comparison gives Persephone's queenship a sharper outline. She is not only the lost daughter of Demeter, she is the sovereign beside whom even heroes must measure their conduct. The return of Cerberus to Hades closes the labor properly. Eurystheus has seen the proof, Heracles has completed the command, and the hound resumes the watch that defines him. Nothing in the ordinary movement of death has changed. Hermes still guides souls, Charon still ferries them, the rivers still mark separation, the judges still wait in the traditions that give them office. Cerberus still guards the way out, and the living world continues above, relieved that the guardian has not remained among it. Heracles' descent became one of the great signs of his heroic reach. He had gone where mortals do not go, handled the creature no ordinary strength could face, and returned without becoming one of the dead. Yet the myth is careful to show that such reach is not freedom from sacred order. His success depends on limit, command, and return. The labor ends not with the underworld opened, but with the underworld restored. From Heracles, the story turns to another living man who approaches the dead without intending to seize them or charm them back. Odysseus will not enter Hades as the strongest hero, nor as the singer whose music bends the court, but as a wanderer in need of knowledge. He will stand among shades who remember life without possessing it, and there, in the voices of Tiresias, Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, and the unburied Elpenor, the kingdom of Hades will reveal not its monsters, but its memory. Chapter 11. Odysseus among the shades. Odysseus came near the dead not as a conqueror of the lower world, but as a man who had lost the straight road home. His ships had passed through storms, enchantments, hunger, violence, and delay, and after the house of Circe, the way forward required knowledge no living pilot could give him. Circe told him that he must seek the soul of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, whose sight had endured beyond death. So the king of Ithaca, still living, turned toward the place where the dead could speak because the living had reached the limit of their own counsel. The journey belongs to the Odyssey's strange and solemn middle, where wandering becomes more than movement across seas. Odysseus has already seen lands that test appetite, loyalty, memory, and restraint, but the encounter with the dead is different from all of them. It does not offer a monster to defeat or a palace to escape. It asks him to stand at the edge of mortality and listen. For a hero known for speech, strategy, and invention, the underworld gives him a task that is almost opposite in nature. He must receive what is said. Homer does not send Odysseus through a fully mapped kingdom in the later style of underworld geography. He sails to the far edge of the world, to the land of the Cimmerians, where the sun does not shine in the ordinary way, and there he performs the rites that allow the dead to gather. The scene belongs to an older imagination of Hades, less architectural than later visions with ferrymen, judges, and named regions of reward or punishment. Yet it is unmistakably the realm of the dead because the living man has reached a border where voices come upward from what has been lost. The ritual is precise. Odysseus digs a trench, pours libations of milk and honey, sweet wine, water, and barley, and sacrifices animals so that the blood may draw the shades. The detail is not ornamental. It shows that speech with the dead is not casual, even for a hero favored by Athena and trained by suffering. The dead require rites. They gather because the proper offerings have been made, and Odysseus must hold them back with his sword until Tiresias has spoken. This is one of the older Greek ways of imagining death. The dead retain identity, memory, grievance, affection, and knowledge, but they lack the fullness of embodied life. They are drawn by blood because blood belongs to vitality. They can speak, but their speech is not the speech of people still seated by a hearth or standing in the light of their own houses. The underworld, in this Homeric form, is not yet a moral court above all else. It is a place where the self continues in a diminished and haunting condition. Elpenor is the first shade Odysseus meets, and his presence gives the whole encounter a human plainness before prophecy begins. He had died on Circe's island after falling from a roof, unnoticed by his companions in the haste of departure. His request is not for glory, rescue, revenge, or high honor. He asks to be buried. He asks Odysseus to return, burn his body with his armor, raise a mound for him by the sea, and place his oar upon it, so that others may know who lies there. The unburied dead trouble the boundary between worlds. Elpenor's plea is small beside the great prophecies and famous heroes who will appear later, but it carries one of the deepest duties in Greek life. The man may have lived obscurely, died foolishly, and left no large mark on the story of kings, yet the rites still matter. The dead are not properly gone until the living have done what is owed. Hades' realm begins, again and again, at the point where remembrance becomes action. Tiresias arrives with the authority of knowledge. In life, he had been the blind seer of Thebes, entangled with some of the most painful stories of Greek myth, and in death he alone among the shades has been granted continuing wisdom by Persephone. Odysseus allows him to drink from the blood, and the prophet speaks of the road ahead, the island of Thrinacia, the cattle of Helios, the danger of the crew's hunger, the delayed return to Ithaca, the suitors in his house, and the further journey inland that must follow even after homecoming. The dead prophet gives Odysseus what the living world cannot give him. He does not remove the suffering ahead, and he does not shorten the sea. Prophecy in Greek myth often clarifies without rescuing. Tiresias tells the wanderer where ruin lies, but knowledge itself will still have to pass through appetite, exhaustion, disobedience, and time. Odysseus leaves the encounter wiser than before, yet not protected from the human weakness of the men who sail with him. After courtly silence, the underworld becomes a place of recognition. Odysseus sees his mother, Anticlea, whom he had left alive when he sailed to Troy. Her presence among the dead tells him what no messenger had carried across the sea. She died grieving for him, worn down not by battle, but by longing for the son who did not return. Odysseus tries 3 times to embrace her, and 3 times she slips from his arms like a shadow or a dream. The gesture is one of Homer's simplest and most painful accounts of death. Love remains, but the body that love wants to hold is gone. Anticlea tells him of his father Laertes, living in sorrow, and of Penelope, still waiting in Ithaca under pressure from the suitors. Through her, Hades' realm becomes a chamber of news, but news altered by the condition of the speaker. She can tell him what has happened at home, and yet she cannot go home with him. She can comfort him with truth, and yet her very truth wounds him. Odysseus has crossed far enough to learn, but not far enough to restore. Then come the women of old stories, heroines and mothers, linked to the divine and heroic families of Greece. Tyro, Antiope, Alcmene, Megara, Epicast, Chloris, Leda, Iphimedia, Phaedra, Ariadne, and others appear in the catalogue of the dead, each carrying a thread into another myth. The passage works like a buried archive of Greek memory. Hades' realm holds not only those Odysseus personally knows, but the ancestral and legendary past of the world he inhabits. The dead gather as genealogy, warning, honor, and sorrow at once. Agamemnon comes next with the bitterness of a murdered king. Once commander of the Greek expedition against Troy, he returned home only to be killed by Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. His shade speaks to Odysseus with the suspicion of a man whose homecoming was ruined at the threshold. He warns him about trust, about women, about the danger hidden inside a palace that should have been safe. The advice is shaped by his own wound, and for that reason it is both useful and limited. Achilles appears with a different weight. In life, he had chosen short glory over obscure survival, becoming the greatest warrior at Troy and dying before the city's final fall. Among the dead, however, he speaks with startling plainness. He tells Odysseus that he would rather serve as a laborer to a poor man on earth than rule over all the lifeless dead. No later honor can fully soften that sentence. It stands as one of Greek myth's clearest refusals to pretend that fame is equal to life. That moment changes the sound of heroic glory. Achilles is still honored, still magnificent in memory, still the central warrior of the Trojan story. But Hades's realm strips glory of warmth. Songs continue above. Names endure among the living. Yet the one who possesses the fame no longer possesses the sun, the breath, the body, or the ordinary hardship he now says he would prefer. The underworld does not deny heroism. It places heroism beside death and lets the comparison remain severe. Odysseus gives Achilles news of his son Neoptolemus, and the dead hero takes comfort in hearing of the young man's courage. Even here, among shades, the fortunes of the living matter. A son's honor can reach a father who no longer walks the earth. The dead are diminished, but not emptied of relation. They still care about houses, names, heirs, and the stories that continue after them. Hades' kingdom preserves longing as well as memory. Ajax stands apart. He had quarreled with Odysseus over the armor of Achilles after the great warrior's death, and when the prize went to Odysseus, Ajax's shame and anger led toward his own end. Among the dead, Odysseus tries to speak gently to him, acknowledging the sorrow that came from that contest. Ajax does not answer. He turns away and goes back among the other shades. His silence is more powerful than accusation. In Hades' realm, not every wound is revised by death. The encounter with Ajax gives the underworld another kind of truth. Some divisions outlast life, not because the dead are strong, but because memory can remain fixed when action has ceased. Odysseus can survive storms, giants, enchantresses, and battle, yet he cannot make Ajax speak. The dead may be beyond ordinary power, but they are not beyond character. Their old shapes persist, thinner and sadder, but still recognizable. Other figures appear at the edge of the vision. Minos judging the dead, Orion driving together the beasts he had hunted, Tityos, Tantalus, and Sisyphus in their punishments, and Heracles as a shade or image while the true Heracles feasts among the gods in later theological complexity. These glimpses connect Odysseus's Homeric underworld with the wider realm traced in later chapters of Greek imagination. Judgment, punishment, heroic exception, and dim common death all occupy the same sacred territory, not always harmonized, but all belonging to the lower world's memory. Fear finally rises in Odysseus, and he withdraws before more dead can gather. His courage has limits, and Homer is careful enough to honor those limits. A living man can listen only so long among the shades before the nearness of the dead becomes too much. Odysseus returns to his ship with knowledge, grief, warnings, and obligations. He must bury Elpenor. He must avoid the cattle of Helios. He must reach Ithaca. He must face the suitors. He must continue living with what the dead have said. Hades himself has scarcely appeared, yet the whole encounter belongs to his kingdom. That absence is not a weakness in the story. It shows the reach of his rule. The Lord below does not need to sit visibly in every passage for the dead to gather under his authority. Their voices, their thinness, their memories, their punishments, and their inability to return all speak within the order that bears his name. Odysseus leaves the dead because he still has time. That is the difference between him and those who speak to him from the shadows of memory. He can still obey or fail, still return or wander, still hold his wife, see his son, bury his companion, and stand under the sky that Achilles longs for in retrospect. The underworld gives him counsel, but its deeper gift is measure. It shows him what life is worth by placing him among those who can remember it, but cannot resume it. From Odysseus among the shades, the story turns toward the later and softer names of the god who rules them. Hades has been brother, king, husband, keeper, judges, sovereign, boundary holder, and receiver of heroes who dared to cross into his realm. Yet the Greeks also learned to speak of him indirectly, through the wealth hidden in the earth, through the grain that rises from buried seed, and through the name Pluton, by which fear of the Lord below could be shaped into reverence. Chapter 12. Pluton, the hidden wealth. After the great descents and the remembered voices of the dead, Hades remained what he had been from the division of the cosmos, the ruler of a kingdom most mortals would enter only once. Yet Greek religion and imagination did not leave him only with the hard sound of his earliest name. The god below could also be called Pluton, the wealthy one, a title that softened direct address while revealing another side of his power. The same earth that covered graves also held seed, root, metal, and the stored richness from which human life drew bread, tools, and treasure. The name Pluton did not make Hades gentle in a simple way. It did not turn him into a god of open fields like Demeter, or a bright giver of increase like the powers associated with spring and harvest. Instead, it recognized that what lies beneath the visible world is not only loss. The underworld receives the dead, but the ground beneath the living also hides the means by which life continues. Grain disappears into soil before it rises. Ore must be drawn from darkness before it becomes useful in the hands of craftsmen. Wealth, in this older religious sense, is often something covered before it is revealed. That double meaning gave Hades a different kind of reverence. To call him by a softened title was partly caution, because the Greeks were not careless with powers connected to death. Names could summon attention, and divine attention was not always a thing to seek directly. Yet indirection also allowed worshippers to approach the god through what he possessed rather than through what they feared. Pluton was not another god entirely in many traditions, but Hades understood through abundance hidden below. Persephone remained essential to that softened understanding. Without her, Hades' realm might have stayed more firmly associated with final reception alone. With her, the lower world also touched the rhythm of return, the sacred disappearance and reappearance that Demeter's story gave to the agricultural year. Persephone's descent did not become the same thing as a seed's burial, but Greek imagination allowed the two to speak near one another. What goes below may be lost, changed, guarded, or prepared for another form of appearing. The Eleusinian mysteries held this nearness with unusual care. Their rites were secret, and the ancient world respected that secrecy so strongly that later readers cannot reconstruct them with full certainty. Still, the testimony that survives suggests that initiates received a hope connected with Demeter, Persephone, and the fate of human beings after death. The promise was not ordinary information. It was an encounter with sacred pattern, one in which loss, descent, return, and blessedness were held together without being exposed completely to public speech. This secrecy is itself worth noticing. Greek religion was often public, civic, and visible, with processions, sacrifices, festivals, statues, and temples belonging to the shared life of a city. Eleusis preserved another mode, where what mattered most was not displayed to everyone. The hiddenness suited the gods involved. Demeter's grain rises openly, but its beginning is covered. Persephone returns, but part of her belongs below. Hades rules, but his most reverent titles often avoid calling him too plainly. In vase painting and later art, Hades could appear enthroned, sometimes beside Persephone, sometimes holding a cornucopia or scepter, sometimes marked by the dignity of a king rather than the terror of a monster. The cornucopia especially belongs to the Pluton side of his identity, the sign of abundance rather than mere darkness. Such images do not erase the fear of death. They place it beside another truth, that the earth's hidden chambers are not empty. They are full of what the living both dread and need. Roman religion inherited and reshaped much of this divine world. Hades became Pluto in Latin usage, while Disparta, another underworld god of wealth and ancestral depth, also touched the same field of meaning. Proserpina carried the story of Persephone into Roman imagination, and Ceres carried Demeter's grief and grain under another name. The Greek underworld did not pass unchanged into Rome, but its central patterns remained recognizable: a god below, a queen who moves between worlds, a mother of grain, and a sacred relation between burial, fertility, and hidden wealth. Later centuries would often confuse Hades with ideas that did not originally belong to him. He was not the Greek devil. He was not a rebel against the high god. He did not tempt souls away from goodness, nor did he invent death as a personal cruelty against mortals. He ruled the dead because the cosmos had been divided, and his portion was necessary. That distinction matters because it restores the older severity of the figure. Hades is frightening not because he is evil, but because he is final, lawful, and not easily moved. Thanatos, the personification of death, occupied a different place. The Moirai, or Fates, also shaped the span of mortal life in ways that no simple underworld kingship can replace. Hermes guided souls. Charon ferried them in later imagination. The judges distinguished them. Cerberus guarded the threshold. Persephone received and reigned beside the king. Hades' power was therefore part of a larger sacred administration. He was central, but not solitary in function. The lower world had many offices because death, to the Greek imagination, was not one act, but a passage, a condition, and a continuing relation with those left behind. The living maintained that relation through graves, offerings, laments, and memory. Families poured libations, brought small gifts, marked tombs, and spoke names. Cities honored heroic dead. Poets carried the voices of Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, and others into new generations. The dead were gone from ordinary life, yet they were not absent from culture. Hades' kingdom held them, but human remembrance continued to reach toward them, sometimes with love, sometimes with fear, and often with a mixture of both. This is why Hades' story cannot be reduced to the moment of dying. His realm begins after that moment and extends into ritual, inheritance, memory, agriculture, justice, poetry, and language itself. To speak of someone going to Hades was to speak of departure, but also of belonging to an order older than any one household. The god below gave myth a way to imagine where the dead had gone when the pyre cooled, when the grave was closed, when the mourners returned home and found that the world still required bread, sleep, work, and speech. His distance from Olympus also endured. Zeus's stories multiply because he desires, commands, punishes, rescues, deceives, and intervenes across the upper world. Poseidon's anger rises around ships and cities. Athena advises heroes. Apollo sends plague and prophecy. Artemis guards wildness and young life. Aphrodite unsettles love. Ares follows conflict. Dionysus dissolves boundaries with wine and ecstasy. Hades appears less often because his office does not require restlessness. Every mortal already travels toward him. He does not need to chase the story. That stillness gave him a majesty different from the brilliance of Olympian power. His kingdom did not depend on persuasion, popularity, or repeated display. Mortals might avoid his name, but avoidance did not weaken him. The wealthy, the poor, the beautiful, the forgotten, the strong, the cunning, the beloved, the guilty, the wise, and the foolish all entered the same broad fact of his rule. The differences among them might matter afterward, in judgment, honor, punishment, or memory, but the first passage belonged to all. Persephone's throne beside him kept that rule from becoming one-note severity. She brought into the underworld the story of a daughter mourned above and a queen honored below. Demeter's grief gave the world a season of withdrawal and return, and Eleusis gave worshippers a secret hope that the public myths did not fully explain. Through Persephone, Hades' house touched the flowering field. Through Pluton, it touched the wealth under the soil. Through judgment and punishment, it touched the moral imagination. Through Homer's shades, it touched memory. The old stories did not resolve all these meanings into a single doctrine. They allowed Hades to remain many things at once. Brother of Zeus, husband of Persephone, son of Cronus and Rhea, king of the dead, holder of hidden wealth, host of heroes, keeper of offenders, and lord of the realm whose name people used when they meant both the god and the place. That looseness is not a flaw in the tradition. It is how myth keeps room for dread, reverence, poetry, ritual, and ordinary human uncertainty. In the end, Hades' power lies partly in how little he needs to explain himself. The living world speaks around him, softens his name, gives him titles, paints him with symbols, tells of those who entered his realm and returned, and honors those who did not. He remains beneath the stories as much as inside them. The sky may flash with Zeus's authority, and the sea may carry Poseidon's moods from coast to coast, but the lower kingdom waits without hurry, receiving what comes to it in the appointed order. The fade begins here, not by leaving Hades behind, but by staying near the hidden continuities that made his name endure. Pluton, the wealthy one, keeps the softer title of the god who was difficult to call directly. Persephone's portion below keeps the memory of the pomegranate seeds. Demeter's fields keep the rhythm of absence and return. The dead keep their names where poetry, family, and ritual continue to speak them, while the underworld keeps what cannot return in the ordinary way. No single image can hold all of Hades. A throne beneath the earth holds one part. A three-headed hound holds another. A ferryman's boat, a judge's seat, a singer's backward glance, a hero's grip on the guardian, a mother's torch, a buried coin, a seed under soil. Each preserves a different edge of the same old kingdom. The myths gather these things without forcing them to become one simple lesson. They let the god remain remote, necessary, feared, and honored. For the Greeks, this was enough. The dead needed a place. The living needed rites. The seasons needed a story that could carry grief without stopping the grain forever. Offense needed consequence. Heroism needed a boundary it could approach but not abolish. Memory needed a house where old voices might still be heard in poetry even after their bodies had gone back to earth. Hades ruled at the meeting point of all these needs. He was not the end of meaning, but the god who received lives after their visible meanings had loosened from the world above. He did not brighten death, and he did not make it gentle in any easy sense. He gave it order. In that order, the Greeks placed fear, hope, punishment, reverence, silence, and the strange comfort of believing that even what vanished had not fallen into nothing. So the story settles where his oldest title and his softened name meet. Hades, unseen lord of the dead, remains Pluton, keeper of the hidden richness beneath the ground. Above him, fields open and close with the seasons. Below them, roots hold in the dark, seeds wait inside the soil, and the earth keeps its covered things with a patience older than speech. The journey is complete. Rest well.